There's a version of American history that gets taught in schools. It mentions these three names briefly, as titans, as innovators, as the men who built the modern economy. It presents them as exceptional individuals who rose through talent and hard work and seized opportunity at the right moment. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in a way that is not accidental, because what it leaves out is the mechanism, the how, the specific, documented, deliberate strategies these men used to not just build wealth, but to build systems that made their wealth permanent, self-reinforcing, and inheritable across generations. And it leaves out the fact that those systems, the legal frameworks, the financial architectures, the institutional arrangements they constructed, are still running today. Still shaping who gets wealthy and who does not. Still determining the rules of a game most people do not even know they are playing. This is not the version you were taught. This is the full account. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York, to a father who sold patent medicines from a wagon and a mother who kept the household together on almost nothing. He grew up understanding scarcity, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily physical reality. A family that counted every cent. A household where waste was not a moral failing, but a practical catastrophe. By the time he was 16, he was working as an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio, recording every transaction in a ledger with a precision that his employer found almost unsettling. He did not spend money he did not have. He did not borrow without a plan to repay. He tracked every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out with a consistency that looked, to the people around him, less like discipline and more like compulsion. And he did not, even at 16, think about this week. He thought about what the numbers would look like in 10 years. That single habit, the ability to subordinate the present to a future most people could not yet see, would define everything that followed. Andrew Carnegie was born 8 years earlier in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a one-room cottage where his father operated a hand-loom weaving business that the Industrial Revolution would render obsolete within a decade. The family emigrated to America in 1848 with almost nothing. Carnegie was 13 years old and already working. First as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory for $1.20 a week, then as a telegraph messenger in Pittsburgh, then as a telegraph operator whose speed and accuracy brought him to the attention of Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was not yet 20 when Scott made him his personal secretary and assistant. Carnegie learned something in those years working beside Scott that would define everything that followed. He learned that the men at the top of large organizations were not necessarily smarter than the men below them. They simply had access to information that others did not, and they used that information to make decisions that compounded over time. He also learned something more specific and more actionable. He learned that the real money in the railroad business was not in running trains. It was in the companies that supplied the railroads with what they needed to run. Iron, steel, bridges, the infrastructure behind the infrastructure. He filed that observation away and waited for the right moment to act on it. John Pierpont Morgan was born into a different world entirely. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a prominent banker, first in Hartford and later in London, and JP grew up understanding finance not as something to be learned, but as something inherited, a natural language spoken at the dinner table, a set of assumptions about how capital moved, and what it was for that most Americans never encountered at all. He attended the English High School in Boston. He studied mathematics in Göttingen, Germany. He spoke French and German fluently. By the time he entered his father's firm in his early 20s, he already understood that the real power in a modern economy did not belong to the men who made things. It belonged to the men who controlled the money that allowed things to be made. That distinction between the producer and the financier, between the man who builds and the man who funds the building, was not widely understood in mid-19th century America. Morgan understood it completely, and he spent the next 5 decades proving, in transaction after transaction, that the financier holds a structural advantage over the producer that no amount of productivity or innovation can overcome. 3 men, 3 completely different origins, 3 completely different entry points into the American economy. And yet what they built, what they understood, and what they left behind connects in ways that most history books never examine honestly. The connection is not biographical. It is architectural. Each of these men, working in his own domain, arrived at the same fundamental insight that the goal was not to compete within a system. The goal was to design the system itself. And once you design the system, you do not need to keep winning. The system wins for you. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if this is the kind of history that finally shows you the full picture, hit subscribe. The Empire File exists for one reason: to show you what they never taught you. Rockefeller entered the oil business in 1863, 2 years after the first commercial oil well had been drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The industry at that point was chaotic. Hundreds of small operators drilling, refining, and shipping with no coordination, wildly fluctuating prices, and no dominant player. The smell of crude oil hung over western Pennsylvania like a permanent weather system. Men who had been farmers 18 months earlier were pulling barrels of oil out of the ground and trying to figure out what to do with them. Most people looking at that situation saw opportunity. Rockefeller saw a problem to be solved. The problem, as he understood it precisely and without sentiment, was not production. It was waste. The inefficiency of the system, the redundant infrastructure, the price volatility, the competitive undercutting that drove margins toward zero, was destroying value that a properly organized operation could capture. His solution was not to drill more oil than anyone else. It was to control the refining and the transportation of oil that others had already drilled. By 1870, he had founded Standard Oil of Ohio with a capitalization of $1 million. By 1872, he had acquired or driven out of business 22 of his 26 Cleveland competitors in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, a period of approximately 6 weeks during which Standard Oil absorbed the majority of Cleveland's refining capacity. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. He had not done this by producing better oil than anyone else. He had done it by negotiating secret rebates with the railroads that transported his oil, deals that gave Standard Oil a lower per barrel shipping rate than any competitor could match, and that in some cases require the railroads to pay Rockefeller a portion of what they charge his competitors to ship. His competitors were, in effect, subsidizing his competitive advantage every time they shipped their own product. It was legal at the time. It was devastating in practice. And it was a masterclass in understanding that the real leverage in any industry is never in the product itself. It is in the infrastructure that moves the product. Control the pipeline and you control the industry. Control the railroad rate and you control who can compete. Rockefeller never needed to be the best oil producer in America. He needed to be the one person through whom all American oil had to pass. And by 1880, he was exactly that. Carnegie's path to dominance ran through steel and through a principle he stated explicitly and without apology in his own writing. Put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket. While other industrialists of his era diversified across industries, spreading risk and spreading attention, Carnegie concentrated everything. He invested his entire fortune, his entire organizational energy, and his entire attention in steel production at a moment when American infrastructure, the railroads, the bridges, the skyscrapers, the naval ships, was creating demand for steel at a scale the world had never seen before. He built his first major steel plant, the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, in Braddock, Pennsylvania in 1875, naming it after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, his largest customer. That was not sentiment. That was strategy. But what made Carnegie genuinely formidable was not his concentration of capital or his relationships. It was his obsession with the cost of production. He drove costs lower every single year, not through cutting wages alone, but through relentless technological investment, through vertical integration. Owning the iron ore mines in Minnesota, the coal fields in Pennsylvania, the limestone quarries in Ohio, the Great Lakes steamships, the railroads that connected every piece of the supply chain, and through an insistence, which bordered on the pathological, on knowing at every moment exactly what it cost to produce 1 ton of steel. His plant managers received daily cost sheets. Carnegie himself reviewed them from wherever he was in the world. A manager who could not explain a cost increase was a manager who would not remain a manager long. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel annually than the entire steel industry of Great Britain. One man's company, one country's entire industry. The numbers were not close.
Morgan watched both of these men from the position he had always occupied, the position of the man who controlled the capital. He had reorganized the railroads of the eastern United States in the 1880s and 1890s, a process that became known as Morganization, in which he would take over a financially distressed railroad, restructure its debt, replace its management, and install a representative on its board to ensure that the reorganized railroad did not again engage in the destructive competitive practices that had driven it to insolvency. By the time he turned his attention to steel, he had already reorganized General Electric, helped stabilize the federal government's gold reserves, and built a network of financial relationships that gave him effective influence over more of the American economy than any elected official possessed. In 1901, he purchased Carnegie Steel for $480 million, the largest private financial transaction in American history to that point, and combined it with several other steel companies to create United States Steel, the first corporation in American history to be capitalized at over $1 billion. Carnegie, when handed the check, looked at it for a long moment and told Morgan he should have asked for $100 million more. Morgan reportedly said he would have paid it. It was not a boast. It was an acknowledgement from one architect to another of what had actually been built and what it was genuinely worth. Morgan's real power was never in any single company or any single transaction. It was in the network of financial relationships he controlled. The web of directorships, the trust arrangements, the bond issuances, the currency stabilization operations that he conducted privately when the United States government could not stabilize its own financial system. In 1895, when the United States Treasury was on the verge of running out of gold and the federal government was paralyzed by political disagreement over how to respond, President Grover Cleveland turned not to any public institution, but to J.P. Morgan, who organized a private syndicate that supplied the Treasury with $62 million in gold in exchange for government bonds, stabilizing the currency and preventing what could have been a catastrophic financial collapse. Morgan made a significant profit on the transaction. The government had no alternative. In 1907, when a banking panic triggered by the collapse of a copper speculation scheme threatened to bring down the American financial system entirely, it was Morgan who convened the leading bankers of New York in his private library on Madison Avenue, a room lined with Renaissance paintings and illuminated manuscripts, and essentially locked them inside until they agreed to a coordinated rescue plan that stopped the panic. He was 70 years old. He sat at a card table in the corner playing solitaire while the bankers negotiated. When they reached an impasse, he stood up, walked to the table, pointed to the document that needed to be signed, and told the assembled bankers that this was what they were going to do. They signed it. The Federal Reserve System, established 6 years later in 1913 in significant part as a response to the realization that it was not acceptable for the stability of the American economy to rest on the willingness of one private citizen to intervene, was designed at a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November 1910. The men who attended that meeting, Senator Nelson Aldrich, representatives of the Rockefeller banking interests, representatives of the Morgan banking interests, and several other senior financial figures, spent 9 days drafting the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. They traveled to Jekyll Island in a private railroad car with the blinds drawn, using first names only to avoid being identified. The central bank they designed reflected the understanding of how banking worked that Morgan had demonstrated in 1895 and again in 1907. His fingerprints are on the institution to this day. What these three men shared was not simply ambition or intelligence or even ruthlessness, though all three possessed those qualities and quantities that their contemporaries found extraordinary and sometimes frightening. What they shared was a complete and unsentimental understanding of systems. Rockefeller understood the oil distribution system and found its leverage point, the refinery, the railroad rate, the pipeline. Carnegie understood the steel production system and found its cost structure, the vertical integration, the daily cost sheet, the relentless elimination of inefficiency. Morgan understood the capital allocation system and found its choke point: the bond issuance, the board seat, the private rescue that made the government dependent. Each of them then moved with patience and precision that their competitors consistently underestimated to position himself at that leverage point, that cost structure, that choke point, and held it for decades. The Standard Oil Trust was broken up by the Supreme Court in 1911 following years of investigation and the publication of Ida Tarbell's devastating investigative history of the company. But the 34 companies it was broken into, including the companies that would eventually become ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP America, were all initially owned by the same shareholders. Rockefeller's personal fortune did not decrease when Standard Oil was dissolved. It increased, as the newly independent companies were valued separately by the market, and their combined worth exceeded the trust's previous valuation. The dissolution of his monopoly made him richer. He lived to be 97 years old and died in 1937 as still one of the wealthiest human beings who had ever lived. Carnegie gave away approximately $350 million before his death in 1919, the equivalent of several billion dollars in today's money, funding over 2,000 public libraries across the English-speaking world, establishing Carnegie Mellon University, and creating the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He died believing, sincerely, that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. Morgan died in Rome in 1913 at the age of 75. When the inventory of his estate was completed, his total wealth was found to be approximately $80 million, a figure that prompted John Rockefeller, who was worth 20 times that amount, to remark that Morgan was not, in fact, a rich man. He had simply controlled the money of men who were. The lesson most people take from Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan is about scale, about the audacity of building something so enormous. That is the wrong lesson. The right lesson is about architecture. Each of these men understood, at a level most of their contemporaries never reached, and most people today still have not fully grasped, that the goal was not to win a competition. The goal was to design a system in which competition itself was structured to your advantage. They did not play the game better than everyone else. They built the game, the rules, the infrastructure, the financial architecture. And once you build the game, once the structure is yours, you do not need to keep winning. The structure wins for you, long after you are gone, in libraries that still stand in cities across America, in banks that still bear the institutional DNA of the men who designed them, in an oil industry whose modern shape was determined by decisions made in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1872. In a financial system that still reflects, in its deepest assumptions, the understanding of three men who grasped earlier than almost anyone that the real currency of lasting power was never money. It was architecture, and architecture, built correctly, never stops working.